Okay, hi everyone. My name is Kelly, and I'm doing my social impact assessment critique over the development of the Sydney Zoo, which is located in Sydney, Australia. And at the time of this proposal, which was in 2017, the zoo development was still under assessment. So it was just like in a proposal stage, basically. And it was proposed to go into um, an area which was just west of Sydney. And basically how they did this proposal was they split it up into three different scenarios. And scenario A would be the zoo got approved. And they also kind of dissected the coexistence with Featherdale, which was another wildlife conservation center in the area in Sydney. And basically they drew a lot of its data from that center as far as like different tourist groups would go and how the tourists would play out in the zoo. So Featherdale, they were also worried that with the development of the zoo that Featherdale might kind of get like shoved out of the market. So that's scenario B, talking about that the Sydney Zoo gets approved, but subsequently Featherdale would suffer financially from the development of the zoo. And then scenario C, which would be Sydney Zoo is not approved, and so basically everything just kind of remains the same. But that scenario obviously was the least preferred, the most preferred being scenario A. And basically this report, they very like positively about the development of the zoo. Even people from Featherdale, they did a lot of surveys with employers and employees in Featherdale, and people had a lot of comments, positive comments about the zoo. And basically, these are some of the most significant social benefits they found about the Sydney Zoo. So they talked about government policy objectives, tourism infrastructure, travel time savings, wildlife education was a big one, advancement of Indigenous peoples, social benefits, amenities, Western Sydney Parklands vision, which was kind of just an investment that would happen to enhance recreational opportunities within the zoo and in Western Sydney. It talks about employment initiatives, Aboriginal cultural programs, which was culture was a big thing. Talked about vocational training, design, conservation funding, because obviously this is a zoo, and as we know, zoos do a lot of conservation funding, and then education outcomes. You know, you can learn a lot going to the zoo about animals and if they're endangered species, you know, there's a lot of attractions and stuff, which is awesome. So basically, let's see here. So the project was proposed by the applicant. So basically, I'm not sure how the laws go exactly in Australia, but it's similar to the US, where if it's a federally funded program, you basically have to do a social impact assessment. So, I mean, it's in compliance with the Department of Planning and Environments. And they kind of have their own guidelines for social impact assessment. And so, yeah, all of this was in compliance with the federal guidelines. So basically, the goal of this SIA was to mitigate the potentially adverse effects that the zoo may have on the different groups of people that locate themselves in Sydney. And I think this SIA did a really good job of sharing different mitigation strategies that they would recommend to kind of help counteract the negative effects that the zoo may have. And there wasn't really that many, more so like relocation and some environmental degradation, but because as we all know, zoos are pretty conservation friendly. There wasn't that many adverse reactions. So here's like a chart that they were talking about different mitigation strategies, which I thought was cool. They talked about, they kind of had like 6 different impacts they talked about, and they categorized them like this one, the way of life and culture, loss of social interaction opportunities for Western Sydney. And they even said that these would be unlikely, even if they were to occur. And so some mitigation that they decided that would help this would be Sydney Zoo design already includes extensive opportunities for social interaction. Sydney Zoo to identify and pursue opportunities for community engagement and outreach, including attendance and local community events. So that's really interesting. Yeah, so here's kind of some context of the zoo and kind of how it was assessed. The assessment really talks about the educational programs the zoo will provide, conservation programs, social impacts, of course, and tourism. Tourism was a big one. And a lot of the tourism that was likely to come out of the zoo would kind of shift the different, like the infrastructure in the area, and like different restaurants, kind of like complimentary, like bars and stuff, and hotels even. So I did say in my critique that that wasn't really discussed in the SIA. Like it wasn't talked about really what, like there was tourism discussed, but not really in depth. So I said that in my critique. That could have been more of a strong point. And these, like in that table above, you saw the categories of the different impacts. This is kind of how they categorize them. And I'm pretty sure the greatest impact I know was health and well-being, fears and aspirations, which is kind of interesting. And then way of life too. So this is kind of the area that they were talking about where the zoo would be developed. And here is some more information on Featherdale. You kind of just goes to see like how much money that these places can bring in. It's crazy. And so a lot of the data collected in this SIA was kind of in comparison with Featherdale. So they took a lot of the social programs that Featherdale had and they compared them with what was proposed to be in the Sydney Zoo. And yeah, they just kind of like drew comparisons through there and to see, you know what I mean, how these programs would kind of play out in the zoo and how they played out in Featherdale. So they kind of evaluated that a lot. And they did a lot of public participation with the Featherdale employees. And so that was really beneficial for the research and kind of how like the future implications of the zoo development would play out in Sydney. And it's kind of talking about the different conservation programs and then again comparing them. And it's talking about stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement was a big one, a big part of public participation. They talked a lot about not only with Featherdale, but other conservation-oriented centers. And they talked a lot with just people in that industry to kind of gain more insight of, you know, how this development would play out. I also said in my critique that I think I think the SIA could have done a better job at scoping out different kind of people for the public participation, because it wasn't really explicit in how they found these people. I know they talked with, quote unquote, they said people that were going to be future visitors of the zoo, but they didn't really, you know, they didn't really talk about, like, I think they could have done a better job at specifying more specifically like the people that were at higher risk for being affected by the zoo's development. And these are kind of like some of the parks and stuff that I was talking about. They would connect with in the educational programs and wildlife parks. Here's some stuff about policy and employment. Employment was a big thing that they were talking about that the community could really need or could really use as a benefit. And here's kind of them talking about the evidence and review, the tourism, education, social, and experience. These were the biggest ones that they talked about. So overall, I gave this an A- grade on my critique. Like I was saying, I think they could have did a better job at like picking out people that were more affected by the development and are going to be at higher risk. And I think they could have talked to them more closely. And even though they did have positive comments and areas for comment and public participation, I think they could have done a little bit stronger, because as we talked about in class and in the textbook, that's like a big public participation is a big part of an SIA. And even though if you have a small component upon it in it, you kind of need it throughout the entire SIA process. So I kind of talked about that. And I even talked about like in a city like Columbus, I know the zoo is like a big part of our city. And I think like in Sydney it would be too. And you could kind of look at it as in order to get the public more involved, you can kind of look at it as in like a future, like how the zoo will affect future generations, because they are going to slowly become part of the public and be a part of the people who are visiting the zoo. So how in the future will this development affect those types of people who aren't even born yet? And I think that's something that this essay could have drawn upon. Yeah, and here's talking about stakeholder engagement here. And they had a lot of graphs and cool findings. But yeah, and other than that, that's kind of all I have to say. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.